Thank you, Mayor Villaraigosa, for sharing your experiences. I know I speak for everyone that we hope you continue to share your insights on how local governments and how state and national governments can tackle these challenging issues. We also hate to admit this, but Northern California does have things to learn from Southern California. and San Francisco shouldn't be lagging behind in these matters. The other thing we can learn from you is how to speak engagingly without the crutch of the PowerPoint, because as academics, we are incapable of standing in front of an audience without the slides going. Our next speaker today is Ms. Lisa Jackson, who served as administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in the first Obama administration from 2009 to 2013. During her tenure as administrator, Ms. Jackson pledged to focus on core issues of protecting air and water quality, preventing exposure to toxic contamination in our communities, and reducing greenhouse gases. With all of EPA's efforts following the best science, adhering to the rule of law, and being implemented with unparalleled transparency. Ms. Jackson is the first African American to serve as EPA administrator, and as some of you know if you follow the Moth podcast, she tells a poignant story of her journey from the Ninth Ward of New Orleans to the highest levels of our nation's capital. At EPA, she made it a priority to focus on vulnerable groups, including children, the elderly, and low-income communities that are particularly susceptible to environmental and health threats. In addressing these and other issues, she promised all stakeholders a place at the decision-making table. Jackson is a summa cum laude graduate of Tulane University and earned a master's degree in chemical engineering from Princeton University. Ms. Jackson will be joined on stage in conversation with Professor David Sedlak. And David is he's the co-director of the Berkeley Water Center and also the co-chair of today's symposium. Professor Sedlak's research examines the fate of chemical contaminants in wastewater treatment plants, steroid hormones in the aquatic environment, and advanced technologies for treatment and reuse of wastewater. Please join me in welcoming Lisa Jackson to Berkeley.
Well, thanks for coming, Lisa. Among the many things that I'm unqualified to do at the university, interviewing you stands out as one of the highest on my list.
You have a PhD. You can handle it.
Well, Terry Gross wasn't available. So I'd like to ask you some questions today about your time at EPA and to see if you can give us some insight, especially with relationship to water and climate adaptation. And please feel free to take these questions in other directions that you think would be interesting to the audience. So I think I'll start and we'll see where it goes from there and kick me if I'm going in the wrong directions. So the Clean Water Act is the primary regulatory authority that EPA has to deal with problems related to water. And it was conceived in a period before we really were thinking a lot about climate change and climate change adaptation. So do you think the Clean Water Act needs an overhaul, particularly with respect to climate change?
First off, hi to everybody from EPA. Don't raise your hands, because then you'll have to explain why you're here instead of but hi to Berkeley as well. Thanks for having me. And so Clean Water Act, let me think on that. We were talking about it outside a little bit, and I got some help from the EPA folks. The Clean Water Act in general had a specific set of goals which were around water quality, access to water from the standpoint of recreation, but not necessarily water quantity. So some might say on first blush that it's not maybe the primary place in the federal government where these discussions should happen. That being said, EPA has done an amazing job, as usual, of thinking about adaptation issues for much, much longer than we've really started discussing them. We were talking, I think today the New York Times has an article saying that the president's adaptation plan is getting some amount of announcement today. We weren't sure of the details, but the federal government started to talk about adaptation a lot. The president's climate plan that he announced in June talks about adaptation as well. So I think the Clean Water Act, first and foremost, if you're building infrastructure, which is a lot of what that act has spent most of the money on, needs to look at and plan for flooding or drought or a change in water quantity and intensity of water activities around the planning for capacity. That makes great sense. I think when you look at issues like stormwater, which the Clean Water Act addresses, as long as the Supreme Court allows it to, sadly, is, I think the Clean Water Act has been arguably less able to deal with non-point source discharges as effectively because they do tend to be local issues, very parochial. They require the kind of planning that we heard the mayor speak of so well, which is not just on a city level, but sometimes on a regional level, sometimes on a community level to deal with issues around justice, to deal with issues around equity. And so I think those kinds of things, while EPA can and should give guidance on, the Clean Water Act would need to be revamped a bit if you want to really have EPA 100% in the game. Who else is in the game? The Corps of Engineers. And I used to tell them all the time that if, the title is really the nation's engineers, how can the nation's engineers not have a full-throated, loud plan for how to deal with climate change effects in our nation? We don't have a place for that. And we suffer from the normal issue of infrastructure funding being funded somewhat at the national level through taxes and the distribution around transportation and the Clean Water Act and housing, but not being coordinated into a national infrastructure plan or climate plan.
Well, being more specific, the Comprehensive Environmental Restoration Plan for the Everglades was developed at a time before people really understood or fully appreciated the effects of climate change. So I know the National Academy's given opinions on the effect of climate change on the Everglades restoration, and you've been involved in some of the discussions about the plan. How do you think that plan would look different if the regulatory authority to address climate change and climate adaptation was more explicitly included in the final planning process?
I think we could talk about any plan for a large ecosystem, but the Everglades is a good one because it is so large and it's been so well studied. And it is a place where the Corps of Engineers, for example, has real expertise. I feel like I'm ignoring this side of the room. I'm sorry about that.
I'll ignore them.
Okay, he's ignoring you. And let me just say for the record, one of the reasons I came to California was to lose the suits. I'm very disappointed in everything.
One of the reasons we invited you is so we could put on the suits.
We wear jeans at Apple. It's nice, actually. So I didn't bring them with me. I don't have them in the closet. This is as good as it gets, actually. So we were talking about the Everglades and large ecosystem restoration. So there are many around the country, including Bay Delta and all kinds of ones that are much more local than the Everglades. And I think so the answer is the same for many of them. It's a matter of degree. Listen, you heard I'm from the 9th Ward in New Orleans, and famously after the hurricane there were right and good questions asked by planners and others who care deeply about the city, about what you do when a tragedy, a horrible tragedy, gives you not the opportunity, but the mandate to rebuild and rethink, and how you do that in the context of the human element, which you can say is politics, but it's actually the way politics is supposed to work in a free democratic society, right? People have views, and they tend to be pretty parochial when it comes to where they live and how they live. And so I think the Everglades is a great example of that. In one hand, you would say this whole thing is about a couple of sectors. The agricultural sector, not a stranger to California. The development, real estate development sector, the need for drinking water for the city of Miami and other very well-developed areas in South Florida, which the experts know much better than I. And then the need for conservation, not just for wildlife, but of the actual way that water was managed by by Mother Nature in the lower half of that great peninsula, which is Florida, which is to have the movement of water fairly freely in and out and across that made for a very rich ecosystem, but also a very adaptable one. It is so much less adaptable now because of improvements that are not going to be wiped away whether you think they should or not. I mean, I'm enough of a pragmatist. People often point to me as sort of the green angel in the room, but people have to be taken into account. And I think what the plan would do is make at least some attempt to look forward and give leaders, something else that you have to have in this process, Thankfully, LA certainly had one in UMair. But you have to have leaders who are willing to stand up in front of those city councils and those moneyed interests and folks who are trying to primary you, as in the case of some places in our country, and say we have to look beyond the next 4 years. And that's really hard.
But it was an investment of many billions of dollars, and we think of those kinds of investments having staying power for 50 or 100 years. So I guess I'm curious about the uncertainties associated with the plan and how it will look not 10 or 20 years from now, but 50 or 100 years from now, and whether there was a lack of information that made it difficult to plan for that, or a lack of political will to address climate change adaptation in a straightforward way.
Well, you know, you probably want to have the folks who were around when the plans were being developed way back when, and I don't want to in any way denigrate them. The Everglades Plan is about water quantity and water quality, and if either one of them don't fall within a certain range, you can't have the Everglades. So you can starve the Everglades by giving it too much water. I guess that's not starve. You can overfeed it. You can give it too little water, which is what tends to happen to it. And then if you give it water, just the right amount within the range, but it's the wrong quality, you have the exact same problem, too much phosphorus. So yeah, I think if somebody could have looked way back when, and I think it was, you know, it was emblematic of our country's optimism that we would look at a big ecosystem like this with all the changes that had been made and say, we're going to save it. It's that iconic to us. Same thing's been done in the Mississippi River Delta in my hometown. Once you make that decision, you can question the initial decision, but I don't think you can turn that clock back. So I think you need to look at water flows and recognize the differences. You can make those changes. You could also look at the impact of development and continued development on whether you can ever break the cycle such that you really do get to a steady state. And I think that question's a hard one to answer, and I wouldn't pretend to know the answer.
Well, thank you anyway for taking a shot. You humored me. So during your tenure at EPA, you were a real big advocate for green infrastructure, and I was particularly struck by the plan for addressing combined sewer overflows in Philadelphia by turning to green infrastructure instead of gray infrastructure. But what if it fails to deliver on the promise? Will a city like Philadelphia have to invest additional money in conventional systems of pollution control? And if they do, will this discourage future risk-taking in the future? And if they don't, will that just force people back into more gray infrastructure?
Yeah, I think it's really important when you think about sewage, water quality in large cities to look at what's really happening, not what ideally happens under the Clean Water Act, right? So every regulator has faced the moment where you have to send or enforce against a large city that honestly throws up their hands and says, okay, I have a city with a failing set of infrastructures. I don't have the tax base I used to do. My folks need any number of things, and the federal government is walking away from giving me the kind of funding I used to have. And we're not seeing a change in that pattern, and you want me to spend all my money on sewage and on projects that, by the way, are also incredibly unpopular because I got to rip up the streets and totally disrupt traffic, and people get angry at me on a street-by-street level, right? Fair enough. And, you know, I was an administrator when a lot of the big enforcement cases were brought. I think a lot of them were brought under Carol Browner. And there are tons of mayors who still don't have a great taste in their mouth about the EPA because they felt like we should be on the same side. We're both public entities trying to work for the betterment of our places, and yet I've been hit with this huge order with penalties. We have the same thing in Washington, D.C. And so then you get into the either or, which I don't think is a fair statement, which is either we go ahead and enforce this order against this public entity, which simply doesn't have the money, which just results in more orders that have more protracted schedules and some amount of penalty assigned to it in the interest of fairness, or we try something radically different. And you know, you can argue about how radical green infrastructure is, but I think it's pretty radical if it's done really well. If it's monitored, if it's measured, if it's designed to be more than just an excuse for not building something, but instead engages a community into real discussions on the sub-city level of how we're going to manage this water and how we're going to do it in a way that doesn't end up with raw sewage flowing into our river and our streams. And how are we going to do that without writing off this section of town, right, and not writing off maybe a more affluent section of town. One of my more fun projects was declaring the LA River navigable. And we did it. We did it. I said, listen, some people got famous for walking on water. You can do that in LA. It's concrete water in LA. But it had to be done. Why? Because you had to, I mean, there were some pretty courageous people who made a point of showing it was navigable. But the reason you did it was not just to honor what they did, but because the way the federal apparatchik works around funding and planning when it comes to the Corps of Engineers and EPA and others is that you have to look towards what the river can be, not what it is right now. You can start to think about adaptation plans that use what a river is supposed to be, which is a reservoir that, and its banks and its watershed for water. So the answer to your question is, of course, there's a chance it won't work. And of course, there's a chance that it'll work, but not to the degree we'd like it to avoid the kind of gray infrastructure investments that need to be done. But I would submit to you that in many places, the alternative was it just wasn't going to be done, and we would just be in court still arguing over the gray infrastructure. Instead, I think we should salute leaders, mayors, like Mayor Nutter in Philadelphia as well, who said, you know what, let's try something different. Our people can't do it. And in DC. A great effort there.
I want to change the direction a little bit and ask you a little about your time as EPA administrator. And I think one of the fascinating things that we didn't have in the introduction is that I think you were the first administrator who was trained as an engineer. Is that right?
I don't know.
Well,
I think
most of
that's
them,
right.
most
of them are lawyers.
Yeah, lawyers or politicians. No offense. So I'm kind of curious, how do you think your technical understanding of water and water pollution control affected the way you were able to do the job? And conversely, did your lack of a background in law or public policy or politics get in the way?
I think this is because I have an 18-year-old who's, freshman in college, not at this fine institution, at another big school in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I think engineering is a great profession because I think it teaches you how to solve problems. More important, I think it teaches you that the most important thing you do is state the problem, to really decide what it is you're trying to do, because how you state the problem is really going to determine your answer. Because any road will get you there if you're not careful. So I think it's great training. But I'll give you the advice I gave him, which is, if it takes you a little longer to get that degree because you stop along the way and take some humanities that you just don't have time for, if that means that you learn some of the social sciences, which increasingly in issues of environmental protection, he's not into environmental protection, go figure. He is, but he's not majoring in environmental engineering or anything. Then that's good, because the way we're going to solve these problems is increasingly going to require understanding how people behave and why they behave the way they do, and forming coalitions and working up from the grassroots. I do think the federal system is pretty broken in Washington. And so the closer you can get, whether that's the EPA regional office or a state government or a local government, is really helpful. So yes, I thought being an engineer was a great aid. I think what you do in any case as a leader is you find out what you don't know and hopefully get really good people. So I had great lawyers. EPA has great lawyers, and I had great political appointees who served as counsel as well. And so it worked most of the time.
So when the next presidential nominee calls you and asks for advice about who they should appoint as the next administrator, would you recommend that they look among the ranks of the engineers and scientists instead of among the politicians and lawyers?
Yeah, of course. I would actually, also remember I started at EPA in 1987 as a staff level environmental scientist. And so that was the other huge advantage. I would recommend that they look amongst the extraordinary ranks of talented professionals who know what they're doing and who don't demagogue about issues, but actually understand it. And I pale, like the mayor, I pale in comparison of an understanding of this issue. you know, in EPA, almost any issue that comes up, I'd be at an international meeting and somebody would bring up some esoteric issue I had never heard of. And I would go back to EPA and go, you'll never believe someone, and they'd be, oh yeah, we're working on that. And we would really be working on it, if not in our Office of Research and Development, maybe in a grant through our STAR research program, maybe through some practice or a community-based grant. There's just incredible thinking. And you know, despite all efforts by a lot of folks to discredit that agency, it's the caliber of the people that, and the fact that it's the only place in the federal government that's beholden to no issue except for the environment. There's no second agenda. There's only one at EPA. And I think that's why so many people spend so much time trying to discredit it.
Well, so David mentioned that, that story that you told on the moth, and we all enjoyed it quite a bit. And in that story, which I'd recommend people...
Terrifying experience. It's like stand-up.
Well, you did well. I think that you talked about the importance of a career in public service, and in light of the recent furloughs and budget cuts and general hostility towards government service, could you still recommend a career in public service to the young people in the audience?
Yeah, absolutely.
Why?
Because the alternative would make for a bad answer on the tape. No, of course I can. Listen, I mean, things have changed. I do first think that, again, if there's any message here, some of the action, some of the energy, some of the work is happening at the local level. That's not to say don't, if and when your friendly federal agency or department is hiring, you don't think about lending your skills and talents. That's actually what makes the system go. The other, news about Washington is that there's really smart people in Washington. They're not always the folks with the microphone. But they are, and there's sometimes the folks with the microphone. But that end of it is just one permutation. Until 2009, I was, a career employee. Well, actually before that, because I went to the state of New Jersey for a while at a political level. But I think what you learn. When I first started the government, somebody pulled me aside and said, listen, the thing about the government is that if you're good and you're smart and you really are willing to work and learn, you learn so much and are handed so much responsibility early on, because we're not levels deep as budget cuts continue to happen. And so I did. I had incredible experiences. I understood all kinds of issues in this country based on the training and I got at EPA. It's also a great place for women. I had 2 kids and got my first real promotion after having my second child. Never felt like I paid a fee for any kind of career fee for that. And as an African American, and if you heard the moth, my father worked for the Postal Service. It has historically been a place where people of color and emerging communities can come into their own on issues like the environment. So you can have Latinos and African Americans sitting in a room trying to figure out these issues for our communities. So yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't have to be EPA, although that's good.
Well, there are a lot of other careers that people have where they serve the public interest, and I'm wondering if there are other places where someone might look for serving the environment, and in particular, which ones you think have been most effective.
I think one of the issues is that we have to get past this idea that the only way you have public services if you have a public sector career. There are no white hats or dark hats in that battle. I'm now on the private sector side, and part of my thinking on that was I spent 25 years saying we didn't have to do this. We could figure out situations where we move together that needle. And now I'm at Apple, and I can tell you that it's a pretty extraordinary place to think about those issues because it has scale. It has the same kind of scale that the government has. Maybe I won't say better or worse, but different because it's an international scale. I just was in Asia, happened to have the honor of having dinner with Majun, who you'll hear from later today. Extraordinary man, extraordinary work. But to be able to say to him, hey, what should I be thinking about? and then know that there's an organization behind me that might allow me to work on those issues, is no different in some ways. I think you have to carry the public service ethic, which this generation of students clearly does. We've done a better job of that in this country, of thinking about activism in the person, not the position. And that's what you have to take with you. You serve the public by never forgetting that there's a world outside of whatever it is you're doing on an issue. And if you're called to the issue of the environment, you can't be that parochial. I mean, you can't just clean your little piece of air or this piece of water. The wind blows and the water flows downhill. So somebody's going to be uphill from you and downhill.
Great. So this morning, I think we tried to look at the press release from the White House, and the phone was too small to see it. But I think we both are aware of the climate change adaptation strategy, or the draft strategy, and it identified a number of ways in which climate change affects the agency's mission. And I'm curious, what, in your opinion, is the biggest risk to the EPA's ability to do its job with respect to water that will result from climate change?
What is the biggest risk to EPA's ability to do its job that will result from climate change? I mean, I think that one of the issues is the infrastructure cycle, right? I mean, we know how. Some of the oldest engineering and technical sort of expertise in the environmental field is sort of sanitation and sanitary engineers, right? And it's a profession that until relatively recently, I think one would argue might also be one of the more staid pieces of what we do. Like when I think about air quality, I think about folks who are on the cutting edge of constantly looking at research on new pollutants and new technologies. When you generally think about water technology, drinking water, wastewater, you think about sort of the same things that we've been thinking about for a long time. So one of the things I would hear all the time if I went to a WEFTEC meeting or other trade groups was, we have great ideas of things we can do, but we can't get anybody to go first, to really embrace the idea of doing it on the scale that it would take to do it, say, at MWD or in any large, medium-scale municipality. Can you certify us, indemnify us, give us the ability to make a mistake? Give us the ability to be Philadelphia on issues of technology so that we can actually get our technology sold, commercialized, so we can get past the question everybody asks us, which is anybody else using this at scale? Because I'm not going to be the first, right? And so I think that's going to be a challenge for EPA in times of tough budgets. It's not really EPA's challenge, it's the industry's challenge and us as a society. And then I think, of course, sort of the old bugaboo of green versus non-green infrastructure, which is not just about water. It can be beaches in New Jersey, where I also spent some amazing time, or levees in New Orleans, and elevations and flood walls and sea walls and all that that means, and dealing with drought if you're in agricultural industry. So all this infrastructure around planning for adaptation is something that is hard to get that balance exactly right between doing it, being highly technical, not doing it, being green, if you will, and getting the measurement and the monitoring to know what you're really achieving on something that you want to change now, even though it changes over a long period of time.
I think those are good observations. So we tend to look inward when we think about the EPA, but I'm sure you had chances to meet with your counterparts in other countries. So,
I wasn't actually expecting that. It's a full service school. A lot of things happen. Thank you very much.
Tell your son that when he's looking for graduate school. So you've met people who are your counterparts in other countries, and you're aware of what goes on in other countries. So are there examples of environmental agencies in other countries or other countries that we should be looking towards when we think about climate change adaptation and water?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, that's a hard one, actually, because you can point to the usual suspects in the Nordics or places, or Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. You can even point to large infrastructure projects in UK or other places. But I think some of the really interesting work happens in those places that are dealing with climate change while dealing with growth issues. And there, I'm not going to single out anyone because I think the challenge is the same for everyone, which is committed leaders who know what the right thing is to do, committed technical people in the same agencies that the EPA or other agencies are. Those same people are there. Like when you deal in China, you find incredible technical expertise within the ministries of environment or within the commission and NDRC. It's the ability to make major moves, to make change, and to do it within whatever political system exists, and to do it with an eye on a 10, 20, 30-year horizon. So I actually think you could easily point to the folks who want to tell us what the right things are to do and are doing great science. So from the standpoint of that, there's great science happening. But I think some of the more interesting places are where people are desperately searching for win-wins because it means the difference between lifting 100 million people out of poverty or not. And so you know where those places are as well as I do. I think those places also tend to need the capacity of a partnership, that the kind of expertise like a Berkeley, UCal can bring. And also your students will enjoy those challenges much more as well.
I think that's a good note to end on, a very positive message for a tough topic. So please join me in thanking Lisa for a very nice